Okay. All right. So I don't believe we have an audience yet, but since it's being recorded, I guess we'll just start. And we'd like to welcome Albany Vice Mayor Preston Jordan to this meeting. Thank you for joining us tonight. And if you'd like to start by introducing yourself, and then we can jump into the schedule that we have for tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and share various information with you and hear from you as well. So I was elected last November, no doubt, likely thanks to some of you. Thank you very much. And I've lived in Albany since 1994. Been very active in climate protection, greenhouse pollution reduction, active transportation. Moved here before we had children. I actually moved to Albany because it was for safety. We had some personal safety problems in the previous place we lived. So we actually did the scientific thing, which we hadn't done before, and looked at the statistics and moved based on the statistics rather than what a place looked like. And then years later, as happens in Albany, we had kids, and now they're adults, and one of them has gone to UC, and the other one's studying to be a car mechanic. So it's all pretty awesome. So I'm in that stage of life where I can give back more time to the community now.
Great. It's great to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing about the ranked choice voting and active transportation improvements that are on the agenda for tonight.
Great. I'll jump in on the first topic. I guess I should also mention I'm a geologist, a research geologist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where I've worked since 1990. And I moved to the area from Los Angeles to for my undergraduate education at Berkeley, and then eventually got a master's about 10 years later as well. So pretty fairly Berkeley person at this point, even though I live in Albany. Let's see, I think you need to enable my share capacity.
Okay, I made you co-host, so I think that should give you sharing capacity.
Got it. Did it. All right, so if there's anybody out there in cyber world, feel free to ask questions via whatever mode you can. And of course, those who are here in the Zoom room with us, please jump in and ask questions anytime along the way. I have no preference to run all the way through this in a sort of a drier fashion. Sometimes better to ask the questions when they come up. So just a note on one of the organizations that I co-founded, actually the most recent organization I co-founded is Voter Choice Albany. And that's the organization that got Measure BB on the ballot, which is what we'll be talking about generally. And again, passed last November, no doubt, courtesy in part of some of your votes. So to start off with what Albany's elections have been, including the last November election, by what's called plurality at large. So the plurality part means whichever candidate gets the most votes wins. They don't have to get 50%, they don't have to get 20%. If they get more votes than another candidate, then they win. At large means it's citywide, it's not in a specific district. You know, like some cities have districts, and a lot of people might not be familiar with at large because most Californians live in cities with districts. The larger cities have districts, but actually most cities in California are at large because most cities are smaller cities. So at large, you're electing at large, and you have to fill up multiple seats at one time from the city as a whole. So in plurality at large, we each get to vote for as many candidates as there are seats. So here's an example of the ballot. And you can see it's marked for 3 of the candidates. You can vote for up to 3. that's how the mechanics of this work. You don't have to vote for 3. You can vote for 1, which is called pull-it voting. So, sort of conceptually, the way I think of this election method is sort of creating a dream team from the candidates. You're saying this is the team that I want to get into office, and I want them to represent me. And whichever team has the most fans, then they win everything. You know, just like in a elimination sporting league. You know, like this happened over the weekend. So one team wins it all. No other teams get anything. And the question is this the best approach? Is this the best way to elect representation, to create a legislative body? So to sort of frame that again more visually, as a geologist, I'm more a visual learner than a reader. So let's say you have an electorate, and in the electorate, there are 2 dominant perspectives. We'll call them the orange perspective and the purple perspective. And go ahead and go to full screen here. And you have a number of candidates who run to represent each perspective. So you have 3 candidates on one side, 3 candidates on the other. And so in that case, the orange perspective candidates win all the seats. And the voters who hold a purple perspective are just out of luck. They get no representation. Now, if you double the number of candidates who are trying to run to represent the orange perspective, they can split the vote so much, you know, that those voters vote for so many different candidates that individual candidates running for the orange perspective don't get as many votes as individual candidates running for the purple perspective. And so, oddly, the candidates who are running for the purple perspective win all the seats. So you can actually have a political perspective that's in the minority win 100% of the representation under plurality at large. And so that means you can get these, you know, pretty crazy results that are based on how many candidates ran rather than what is the perspective of the voters. So I'm going to go into an example here about perspective. I'm going to use race and ethnicity as one example of perspective. That's obviously not the only dimension of perspective, but it's a dimension that our society's chosen to collect data on. So in Albany, there are, and this is the number of, or percent of voters in the 2018 general election. So in that election, there are about 16% Asian and Pacific Islander voters, and about 8% Hispanic voters. And so you can see that's not a large percentage of the electorate. So if those voters should have a perspective that they hold, either each individually or the 2 groups combined, it's going to be difficult for those voters to actually get representation. That's a little odd because we have a 5-member council. So you would think that any group that constitutes 20% of the electorate by perspective should be able to get represented. Otherwise, why have 5 people on the council? Why not just have 1 person on the council? So one method that a lot of cities use that I mentioned earlier is to go to single member districts. And that works if there is heterogeneity across the jurisdiction in terms of perspectives. That can be because there's issues that are particular to one geography rather than another. It could be historic systemic racism having to do with redlining, so that you have particular socioeconomic areas of the city that are different than other areas of the city. Don't have those, if it's fairly homogeneous across the city, then you can get essentially a similar result of plurality at large, where each and every district elects a candidate who holds the dominant perspective, and the minority perspective does not get any representation. So looking at if that would be the case in Albany, so this is obviously a map of Albany, and these are notional districts. These are drawn so that the population within each of them is equal based on the 2010 census, and follows some of the major boundaries in Albany, so to the extent possible, so San Pablo Avenue, Solano, Key Route. And so again, looking at this one dimension of race and ethnicity, this is a map of the voting precincts in 2018, which is the smallest geographic unit for which the data is available from the state on the ethnicity of voters. And so this is a map of Asian and Pacific Islander voters as a percentage of the total electorate in that election. And so you can see there is variation across the city. In the very southeastern corner, 9%, 10% University Village, and then as much as 25% or a quarter of the electorate in the condominiums that are on the 500 block of Pierce Street. You might be most familiar with if you've gotten over there there's some high rises there, tallest buildings in Albany. So that suggests you might be able to draw districts in a way that if voters, Asian and Pacific Islander voters, have a perspective that they share that's different than the perspective of the rest of voters, that they might be able to gain representation. So if we look at that and we map these districts, those are the columns that have been added. You can see in that Northwest district, which is the one where the condominiums are on Pierce Street, it does have a higher percentage of Asian and Pacific Islander voters than citywide. It's gone from 16% to 21%. Northern Central District, same. Southwest, which is the Village, is actually lower, as are the other two. So obviously, you can have some that are higher than the average and some that are lower than the average. This is a precinct map of Hispanic voters as a percent of the total electorate. And so in this case, you can see it again, there's some variation, 16% in the precinct that covers University Village, and then a low of 2% in easternmost Albany. So if we add those to the map, you can see that there is one district that can be drawn based on that previous supposition of districts that has a higher percentage of Hispanic voters of the electorate. It's about 12% as compared to 8% citywide. Three other districts are about the average, equal about the average of the city, and the easternmost district is less at 4%. Now that said, when you go to single member districts, in order to win, to guarantee a win, even in a plurality at large, a candidate's going to need the support of 50% of the voters plus one. If there are three candidates under plurality, then they might not need that much, depending on how the vote splits out. But 50% is sort of the threshold, the minimum threshold to guarantee a win. So if we look at these values, percentages of voters of different ethnicities as a percent of the threshold to win in districts or to guarantee a win in districts, we're going to switch from percent of voters to percent of election threshold. You can see that there is the Northwest district. Asian and Pacific Islander voters are a little over 40% of the electorate. In the University Village district, Hispanic voters are a little over 22% of that threshold. So in none of these districts, if those voters vote what's called cohesively, if they share a perspective that's different than white voters, in none of these districts would they have the power to actually elect a representative of their own choice. This would be what's called an influence district. So they're over 50% of what is required to get a candidate into office. And so in coalition with a small portion of the other voters, of the white voters, they would be able to get a candidate into office. I haven't shown a threshold or percent of threshold for the 3-seat and 2-seat elections. So in Albany's at-large elections, we fill 3 seats on the council, one election, the presidential year, and in that election, we fill 2 seats on the school board. And then we switch to 3 seats on the school board and 2 seats on the council in the governor election, which is 2 years later. there isn't, it's even more complicated what the threshold would be, the minimum threshold would be to win a seat in a 3-seat or 2-seat election of plurality at large. It's much more, even more dependent on how many candidates there are. So that's the reason there's no threshold shown here, because it varies so dramatically. So the method that the Voter Choice Albany looked at to improve this is ranked choice at large. And ranked choice at large is a proportional representation method, which we'll go into describing, but this is an example of what the ballot looks like. In this case, I hadn't filled it out yet, but a voter would determine which is their most preferred candidate, and then fill in the bubble for their first choice, second choice candidate, fill in the bubble, so on and so forth. And unlike in plurality, with ranked choice, your voting for your most preferred candidate can never have the consequence of causing your the candidate you prefer the least to be able to be elected, which I'll describe and illustrate further. Whereas in plurality, you have this lesser of two evils, where if you vote for your most preferred candidate rather than your third or fourth preferred candidate, then that might cause your least preferred candidate to be able to be elected. So qualitatively, the way that the vote counting works once the voters have submitted their ballots is akin to a caucus, and I'll give a visual example of how a caucus works. But in words, a caucus would work that the candidates would go and stand in some large space conceptually, and the voters would go stand next to the candidate that they prefer. And if a candidate has very few voters with them, then those voters are likely to walk to a different candidate, their second choice candidate, in the hopes of getting them elected, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the example. So here are our candidates. We're in this large space where the voters can gather. Here are the voters who come in and collected around the candidates that they support as their first choice. And so you can see this candidate has the most voters with them, so they win a seat right out the gate. So they're pretty psyched about that. And this is I should say, a 3-seat, filling 3-seat election. They actually have more voters than they need to be elected, and we can go into the math if anyone's interested in terms of determining how many voters they need to be elected. But for qualitative purposes, you can imagine if one candidate has 90% of the voters standing next to them, then they have more candidates, more voters than they need to be elected. So the voters talk among themselves and decide that some of them are going to go stand next to their next preferred candidate in the hopes of getting 2 candidates of their preference elected. So those voters move to another candidate. And at this point, no second candidate has enough votes to be elected. So the voters who are standing next to the candidate who has the fewest voters with them realize it's not happening for us with this candidate. So that candidate is going to leave, and those voters are going to go to their second choice. And still no candidate has enough votes to gain that second seat. So same process again. And now a purple prospective candidate has enough voters to win. So we have 2 winners now. And we go back to elimination. And now we have all 3 of our winners. So going back to this diagram, you can see in plurality, with this configuration of candidates, it's likely that the orange perspective candidates win all the seats, whereas in ranked choice, it's going to match the candidates to the proportion within the electorate. And it's going to do that no matter how many candidates run, because of this essentially sequence of runoffs that occur. So it doesn't matter how many candidates run to represent each side, the voters will find their way to the strongest candidates who are seeking to represent their perspective. And so in that sense, ranked choice at large is invariant. It doesn't matter what candidates, how many candidates run. And so in that sense, it provides more stable government along with better representation for all the perspectives. Whereas in plurality at large, you can get exactly the opposite government in terms of policy, depending on how many candidates run. So how are we doing, Esther? I've been going on for a little bit here. I don't know if there's any questions.
I don't have any questions in the chat,
Okay.
but maybe someone in the Zoom call has a question.
And that's fine if you don't. I just wanted to check in.
Yeah, looks
Okay.
like we're doing good. I think, yeah, this is a great explanation. It makes sense.
Well, that's music to my ears. Really, it's not always the easiest stuff to explain. So this is I've been working on this since about 2008. But this is sort of where I'm at now after 13 years of doing this in terms of trying to explain the differences between election methods. So another consideration that that Voter Choice Albany took up in trying to think about, do we go to single member district elections, or do we stay at large and use ranked choice voting, which is going to be the better solution, was uncontested elections, because Albany has a problem with that. This is an election where there's either only as many candidates as there are seats, or there are actually fewer candidates than there are seats. And so about 1 out of every 6 city council elections is uncontested. So for instance, in 2014, there were 3 seats available and there were only 3 candidates. And so there was essentially no election. That's not great for democracy, obviously. When the voters don't have a choice, then you're not really getting a good test of the policy direction that the city should take. So Voter Choice Albany looked at what is likely to happen if the city goes to district elections. Is that going to help with this problem? Are you going to get more people running because it's easier to run because they're running in smaller neighborhoods? Or are you going to have fewer candidates? Or are you going to have the same? So Voter Choice Albany identified 7 cities that were at large, and this is using a database, really great database that's maintained by an institute at Sacramento State University with funding from the Secretary of State. So they have a database of all municipal election results and school board election results going back to 1996. So within California, so a great database. And so Voter Choice Albany identified 7 cities in that database that had about the same size electorate, the same number of participating voters on a regular basis as Albany does, and that also transitioned during that period from at-large to by-district elections. So when they were at large, they only had 1 out of every 25 of their elections were uncontested. Voter Choice Albany hasn't tested this hypothesis yet. The current hypothesis is that Albany has higher uncontested election rate because it has term limits. So it's fairly unusual for a small city to have term limits. And in Albany, elected official can only serve for 2 terms. And then they must take at least 2 years off if they want to run again. And in general, people don't run again. There are a few people that have, but in general, that's it. So on the one hand, you get turnover, but on the other hand, you only have so many candidates. People who want to be a candidate are willing to be a candidate and serve on council in the city. And so you don't fill up that candidate pool, or you deplete your candidate pool as compared to a city without term limits. So when these cities that had a lower uncontested election rate under at large went to by district, massive increase in their uncontested election rate. 1 out of 3 elections for council uncontested. And these were highly significant for anybody who's statistically inclined out there. These were highly significant results. School board, Albany has few more, or a bit higher ratio of uncontested elections to all elections for school board, as do the 7 school districts that were identified with similar size electorates. Incredible increase when those districts went to by-district elections. 3 out of 5 of their elections were uncontested, which means the majority of that governing body at any given time did not gain office in a contested election, which at that point you really have to wonder about the quality of governance and whether the policies that are being pursued by the elected officials really match those in the community. So these tended to argue against going to the districts as a solution. So But just to sum up, plurality creates governance on stability. You know, as we saw, depending on how many candidates you have running to represent what perspective, you can get completely opposite results. When you use plurality in district, you can get an increase in uncontested elections. Ranked choice at large provides governing stability and results in fair representation, which increases voter turnout. And so the ballot question here was, yeah, you know, I'm thinking, did I? Yeah, I think I left out a key chart here. So I had a chart that showed the percentage of the election threshold for ranked choice in the 3-seat and 2-seat election relative to that one variable that I've been looking at of race and ethnicity of voters. And in a 2-seat election, the combination of Asian Pacific Islander voters and Hispanic voters was almost 100% of the threshold. It was about 90%, which is to say that citywide, those voters, should they have a shared perspective, would have the power to virtually elect their own representative. And in a 2-seat election, if I recall, it was about 70% of the threshold. In either of those elections, it was a higher percentage of the threshold than it was in the district elections. That was another reason why ranked choice would be a better solution, because it allows for better representation of perspectives in the community, given that Albany is relatively homogeneous in terms of how the perspectives are distributed across the city. So the ballot question was, shall a measure be adopted to change the current method of electing city council and board of education members from obtaining a plurality of votes to ranked choice in order to make Albany's elections more representative of the votes and preferences of its voters? And perhaps not surprisingly, given that kind of a ballot question, it passed with over 73% voter support. And so we will be using this method in 2022 for the first time. This is actually the first time voters have approved going to proportional representation anywhere in the United States in about 80 years. There were about 24 cities that used it in the middle of the last century, and it was wiped out in all of those cities by the white elite. So in those cities, it allowed Black people to gain office for the first time. It allowed socialists to gain office for the first time. And the white elite in each of those cities, except for one, and it didn't matter if it was a Republican elite or a Democratic elite, it worked assiduously to wipe it out. And the only city that they were not successful in is Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a virtual twin of Berkeley, both in demographics and size and somewhat in terms of culture. And Cambridge has been using it since 1941. So we're trying to bring it back. We've actually brought it back in this little corner of the world. And also goes to sort of the myth of American progress. You know, we have sort of, at least in some quarters, this mythology that, oh, we're always moving forward, we're always advancing rights for people, and obviously not the case. Thanks very much.
Yes, so we have a question. Does the city of Berkeley use ranked choice voting?
Yeah, so the city of Berkeley uses ranked choice voting in single seat districts. So they have a directly elected mayor citywide who essentially has the powers of a council member, a little bit more, but they're not an executive in the sense that the mayor of San Francisco or Oakland or Los Angeles is. And then there are 8 districts. The city is divided into 8 districts, each of which elects the city council member. And so they have a 9-member city council. And each of those seats is filled using ranked choice voting. Now, in that case, it's single seat, so it's sometimes called instant runoff voting, because it really is just a series of runoff elections until one of the candidates achieves more than 50%. They do not use ranked choice voting in Berkeley for the Rent Stabilization Board or for the school board. So the Rent Stabilization Board, I believe it's nine seats, I think. And the school board, I think it's 5. And they elect those by plurality at large citywide. So that's the next target. I'll leave it at that.
So for the city of Albany, would this cover all positions within the city then? Or
Yes, the measure was written to cover both city council and board of education. So it'll cover both those bodies. The city of Albany used to have some elected single seat positions. Police chief, actually up until, I don't know, early in the century. And city attorney up until about 10 years ago, and city treasurer up until about 2 years ago. And the city, Albany has a constitution, which is called a charter, which the older cities in California have. The younger cities do not. They just refer to state law for their governing rules. And so under Albany's charter, each of those positions was elected. And then over time, the charter review committee and working with the council decided it was a better idea to have those positions be appointed rather than elected. And I was on the charter review committee during two of those, the treasurer and the city attorney. And the reason was Albany being 20,000 people, there was concern about are you going to get enough candidates running who actually are well qualified in those professions to actually provide high quality service to the city. The decision was it was better to appoint rather than elect to those specific professional positions. And the voters agreed and approved those transitions in each case.
all right, so yeah, so this is, you said this is going to be adopted in 2022 in the city of Albany?
Yeah, so the measure specifies using this method of election in the general election of 2022. And Albany was in a unique position to be able to make this transition. As somebody asked, does Berkeley use ranked choice voting? And the fact that Berkeley uses it, as does Oakland, San Leandro, and San Francisco, going back a decade in the case of the East Bay cities and going back over 15 years in the case of San Francisco, basically familiarized the surrounding electorate with the idea of ranking their vote. And so we were able to take the next step of taking it to the proportional representation method of election, which would have been harder to do right from the start. But because people already understood the ranking vote part, it was easier to take that next step. Also, Albany is in Alameda County, and elections are run at the county level by contract with the cities. So it's a matter of cost savings. The county registrar runs the elections under contract with the cities. And so because Berkeley, Oakland, and San Leandro use ranked choice, the registrar already had ranked choice capable equipment. And so Albany didn't have to face that particular hurdle. Whereas trying to get this method adopted in a county where none of the cities use ranked choice, you would also be having to pay to bring that equipment in, which would be, prohibitively expensive for a city the size of Albany. But in joining with the other cities, it's able to pay a prorated share based on population size that is well within reach of its financial capacity.
So is there any difference between the type of ranked choice voting that was passed here in Albany and the one in the other cities? You mentioned something about it, but I wondered if you could clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So in all the other cities, it's single seat. So in that case, they were really motivated to make the switch in the end by saving money. So each of those cities previously had a majority election requirement. And so they had a primary election, and if no candidate achieved over 50% voter support, they would have to have a runoff. In San Francisco, they had their primary election with the general election in November. And if they needed a runoff, it was usually around December 15th. Obviously, it's a pretty terrible time of year to have an election. And so the voter turnout would plummet from the general election to the runoff. There are actually cases where the candidate who had the most votes in the general election lost to a candidate who got fewer votes in the turnout because the type of voters that turned out changed. So in those separate runoffs, the turnout would be older, whiter, and wealthier. So there were two instances where Asian American candidates who won the most votes in the primary but didn't quite make 50% lost the general because they lost the general to another candidate who was white who got fewer votes than the Asian candidate got in the primary. And then in Berkeley, they would have their runoffs in February. And in Oakland, they had their primary in June and their runoff in November. And so the problem with that was you had, 5 months of a second campaign that candidates would have to fund. So it wasn't great for candidates, it wasn't great for voters, and for the cities, they were having to pay for 2 elections, pay the registrars for 2 elections. And so going to single seat ranked choice actually saved them money because they could do instant runoff. The voters gave the information up front. If we need a runoff election, this is how I would vote in the runoff election. The method that we're using in Albany is an extension on that method to multiple seats. And so I again apologize, I can't believe I missed putting that graph in, but go into the math just a little bit. So in Albany's 2-seat elections, in order for a candidate to win, they will need 1/3 voter support plus 1. And the reason each of the 2 winning candidates needs 1/3 of the voters plus 1 in support is because if you add those 2 portions together, the remainder is less. So no other candidate can get as many votes as they each have gotten individually. What is different about ranked choice multi-seat as compared to plurality at large is each voter only has 1 vote, which says, I as a voter, it's reasonable for me to expect that I will be represented by 1 person on the council, whereas plurality at large, by allowing me to vote for each seat, says to me, it's reasonable for me to expect that all 5 council members will represent me, with the corollary that none of them will represent my neighbor. And that's just terrible democracy. So in ranked choice at large, each voter gets 1 vote and can expect to have 1 representative if they're successful. And more voters will be likely to get representation because in a 2-seat election, at least 2/3 of the voters are going to contribute to electing a representative, which is not the case under plurality at large. In a 3-seat election, each candidate needs 1/4 of the voters in support plus 1. Again, if you add those 3/4 up plus the 3 plus 1s, then the remainder is less. You can start to see the form of the threshold. And it's actually the same threshold for a single seat election. We don't think about it, but the threshold is 50% plus 1 because then that means no other candidate can get as many votes.
Yeah, so did you want to talk about, is there a challenge to this, or what's going on?
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, the situation is a little more complicated. So there was a lawsuit threat letter that was sent to the city a month. The city received it about a month after the city council voted to put this on the ballot. And the threat letter is under the California Voting Rights Act, which provides any voter in the city who's a member of a protected class being defined by race, ethnicity, and language, to have an attorney threaten suit on their behalf and then sue on their behalf. And if the attorney wins, then the jurisdiction against which the suit was filed has to pay for not only the jurisdiction fees, but also for the plaintiff's fees. So the city received one of these threat letters, as I say, a month after the council put this on the ballot. And there's actually a 3-way discussion and negotiation going on right now between the city, the attorney for that potential plaintiff, and Voter Choice Albany regarding whether the attorney accepts ranked choice at large as an acceptable method to resolve what they see as the California Voting Rights Act violation. A violation would be when using plurality at large, the white electorate outvotes on a consistent basis the non-white electorate, such that the non-white electorate, if it has its own unique candidates that it wants to support and get into office, can never get into office. And before I was on the council, I did an analysis of the historic election results going back 3 elections in Albany, and using the statistical test to determine if there is this kind of voting occurring, and found that in all 3 council elections, this kind of voting did occur. So there were candidates who were preferred by voters of color that were not elected, because candidates who were preferred by white voters could dominate because of plurality at large. And so I presented that to the council at the time, and that was in, when was that? I think that was early 2019, and the council didn't do anything in response. That's part of what led to the founding of Voter Choice Albany, was that it could not accept that this situation existed and had to fight for a change. So this ballot measure that you see the question for on here only got on the ballot because Voter Choice Albany ran an initiative campaign, meaning it started gathering signatures in order to force the measure onto the ballot. It gathered about half the signatures it needed in a month, and it had another 2 months to go, and then shelter in place hit last year. So at that point, it turned to the council and successfully was able to press the council to put it on the ballot, whereas 3 members of the 5-member council had been opposing having this measure on the ballot for a number of years before that. So I can't really go into the negotiations because that's confidential at this point, but I can just let you know that they are occurring. And you can invite me back maybe in a year or 6 months, and hopefully it'll be wrapped up, and I can tell you what happened.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions about ranked choice voting? If not, I guess it would be time to move to the next thing on our schedule.
Sure. All right. Let's see here. Okay. Up next, I was going to discuss the cycling routes that exist around University Village and in the nearby environs. Both exist now, and then projects that are in line for the future and potential projects that we're trying to get on the board. And so a lot of this was pursued by Albany Strollers and Rollers, which is an organization I co-founded in 2004, and it's one of the stronger advocacy organizations in the city in terms of size. And so what I'm going to discuss following, I will provide a cheat sheet, a schematic map at the end that captures the existing situation. And we have it in a PDF, and so I can provide it to VRA to put on his website, or maybe it already has it, I don't know. I just want people, it's going to be a lot of information coming at you, and you don't need to remember it all and, you know, where are all these routes and how do I access them, because we have this schematic map that can provide the cheat sheet. So maybe to kick off, obviously we have University Village shown here, and over here, and we have the main campus over here. And so I thought a good way to kick it off, but I don't know how many people are, well, we have 6 participants, including me, so I don't know how helpful this is going to be. We were going to do a poll, but maybe instead we could just have those who are here chime in by voice, and I'll ask some questions, and then the people who, to the extent they're watching on Facebook, they can put it in comments. I'm just curious, I guess at the first level, of those who go back and forth to campus, who uses, let's say, their own car, who uses a bus, or rides a bus, and who bikes or walks. I don't know, maybe I'll start with Asper.
Okay, so I typically, when I was going in person to campus, would use the 52 AC Transit bus as much as possible. Sometimes the 18 route if the 52 was overcrowded, or, depending on that. I never drove to campus myself. I pretty much always used AC Transit.
Yeah, I've got the option of telecommute. Sad face. I don't know if anybody goes to campus anymore. I don't know if May, if you're willing to chime in, how do you get back and forth when you got back and forth, or if you still get back and forth?
Hi, so actually I'm not the student, but my partner is. So he would normally take the bus. I think he did attempt at some point to take bike routes.
Biked a few times.
Yeah, what bike route did you take?
Took the Greenway to the park. What is the long park?
Albany
Albany.
Park.
Yeah. And then all the way down to is it Hearst or?
Yeah, Hearst.
No. What's this? Just the campus, just to the campus.
Oxford, I guess.
Oxford, yeah.
Oxford, yeah.
And so, so you gave it a go. What, as you take the bus now, I'm presuming it was undesirable. You determined it was undesirable for some reason.
It's just I'm I'm a what's the word? I enjoy riding my bike, but it was far for me, and to have a backpack on and all of that. So I was just more used to taking the bus.
Yeah. Well, yeah, when you're on the bus, you can actually, do stuff as opposed to when you're on a bike. I mean, if you have your phone, you can be putting out email on the way to campus or whatnot. So, yeah.
Right.
And then I see somebody named Christopher. If I have that right. I don't know if Christopher's willing to.
Yeah, I'm here. How you doing?
All right.
I usually take the 52 as well. I do not own a bike right now, but it was in the plan to get one in the near future a year ago, and now, of course, that's been put on hold.
And is that on hold because nobody goes to campus anymore, essentially?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And certainly part of why I'm here is I want to hear, how people live in University Village, because I don't have that many opportunities to interact. So I'll go ahead and jump into this. What I've heard actually anecdotally from people who live in University Village and bike previously, in the conversations I've been able to have over the years with just maybe 5 to 10 people, is that they all would head south into Berkeley, like via 9th Street or whatnot, and then head east on Virginia or some other street. They would take this kind of a route rather than going to the Greenway. So May's partner making it to the Greenway. Good on you for figuring that out. I think that's the better route, but part of this presentation is talking about why people might have made that choice and what might happen differently in the future. So there's been a realization in the planning for people to bike world that unlike people driving their own car, there's great heterogeneity in terms of skill, desire, ability, comfort. Cars are designed to essentially standardize us all. And so the kinds of roads and infrastructure that can be provided are sort of standardized along with the car, and not so much for people biking. So you have, some people who are comfortable biking on essentially San Pablo Avenue. And then you have other people that they're not going to bike unless they have their own path. And then, a range in between of comfort levels. There was a survey that was done in Berkeley, a scientific survey, and I just want to stress that, part of the development of its bicycle master plan, where the consultant actually had people go out door to door. They randomized addresses and went door to door, actually presenting this kind of information to people and saying, one, would you ever consider biking? And if you would, which of these facilities would you be comfortable biking on, to actually get scientific data on what it is that Berkeley should be doing in terms of developing cycling infrastructure. So it found that, I got a freeze here. Yeah, try that again. Pardon me, there we go. Happens sometimes, I find, on Zoom. So they found 3% of the population will bike on San Pablo Avenue. Not very meaningful in terms of greenhouse pollution reduction, transportation, all the public health benefits that come from active transportation. They found another 16% would bike if there was a bike lane or a buffered bike lane. The buffered bike lane, you can see in this picture here, it's got a painted buffer that separates the bike lane from the motorist lane, the nearest motorist lane, whereas this bike lane does not. It says a single stripe. And so you can see that here the cyclist is shying away from the adjacent motorist, but at the risk of getting what's called doored. If a driver doesn't see the cyclist coming, and opens their door. One of the main accident modes for people biking. So there's 16% if that infrastructure was available. And if there were protected bike lanes or shared use paths, an amazing 71% of people would bike. And so if you total all of those up with the right infrastructure, this survey in Berkeley found that 90% of people would bike for transportation. Now the problem is we don't have very much of this infrastructure over on the right here. We've got obviously a lot of this. Particularly, I know I experienced, when I started riding for transportation more in the area, I would tend to ride where I drove because that's what I was familiar with. And so I ended up riding a lot of this all the time before Berkeley made some advances, and I realized, it is actually kind of nicer not riding on those main arterials. So we have a lot of this. We have more and more of this in this, but not so much of these. Now zoomed in on University Village a bit. And this by and large is where you all live, where the residences are in University Village. And so that some of the bike routes that are established, there's a buffered cycling lanes along 3 blocks of Marin, which are shown in yellow here to sort of indicate the comfort level. And then the rest is unbuffered bike lanes, just that stripe. So that's in orange. And actually Marin, at the time it first started being thought about in the late 90s, Marin used to actually be 2 motorist lanes each direction. So really a high stress place to ride a bike. And it started being talked about in the late 90s and then was implemented in the mid last decade, that we've taken down to 1 motorist lane each direction with a left turn lane and then a cycling lane on each side. And so that was a big improvement at the time. And it actually at this point has finally been completed. It's the only cycling route from the hills to the bay that's continuous and straightforward anywhere north of Fremont. So pretty good achievement. But on the other hand, it's still a high stress route. So that, as I say, the planning professions advance and realize, okay, that's nice, but you're only going to get maybe 16, 70% of the population to consider and bike by having that kind of facility. Gilman has what are called sharrows on it, which are little symbols with arrows and a cyclist in them. And that's even more high stress because there's no bike lane at all and it's pretty narrow. So in terms of heading east, May's partner Aside, who found his way to the Greenway, and I go back and ask how he got to the Greenway when he did it. None of these routes towards campus more directly are really that appetizing. And so that's, as I mentioned earlier, that's why I think at least a lot of the people I'd spoken to previously would head south, because 8th Street in Berkeley is a bike boulevard, doesn't have that many motorists on it, and then on to 9th Street. But the Greenway, is really the lowest stress route, but it's separated from University Village somewhat by this moat of San Pablo Avenue. So as a part of the construction of the senior residences and Sprouts in the small retail commercial area, Strollers and Rollers managed to get the city to install something called the Hawk signal. This is a signal that is specific to allowing people who are biking and walking to be able to cross a main street like this. So it's only activated by people biking and walking. It's not activated by motorists that come up to it from the side street. And it looks like this. And so you can see this, these are the signal heads here for southbound traffic on San Pablo. And you can see there's somebody over here, and the push button is on this pole, and there's another push button in the middle, there's another push button on the side. And so if a person pushes that button and waits a little bit, motorists, these signals activate. So a little bit of a different style of signal, but for your purposes, they activate, motorists stop, and you're able to cross directly to Dartmouth. So what that allows is riding up Dartmouth. Dartmouth is not like Marin or Gilman. It has fewer than 1,000 motorists a day as compared to Marin has about 20,000 motorists a day. I don't know what the count is on Gilman, but it's a relatively quiet street. So it actually provides a means to get across this moat and via this quiet street up to the Greenway. As a part of building that project, a block of path was also built along Cornesis Creek, which runs across the southern boundary of the city here and the southern boundary of University Village. So that's shown here in blue again, because that's a path that's entirely separated from motorists. Now, there's a piece missing here because you've got paths within the village that make a nice connection through the village to this point, but there's no path from there over to this one block of path here. The city has put in for funding with the county to build this. The city's already paid to have it engineered. All the engineering drawings are done. It's applying for construction funding. And without going into details, it's very likely that it will get that funding, very highly likely. And it's going to get that funding, if it gets the funding in about a year. And so construction would start sometime after that. So if you're a master's student, sorry, it probably is not going to happen in your time. If you're an early PhD student, then maybe so. And when that piece is done, it will provide a connection from pretty much anywhere in the village via this route and along Cornesis Creek to this signal and up to Dartmouth. So finally, there will be a good connection across this moat of San Pablo Avenue to get to the Greenway, either just for recreation or actually for transportation to the campus. On the other side, for recreation, there's the Bay Trail, which some of you may have been out to. And this piece along the Golden Gate Fields property was finished. I think they opened it a little less than a year ago, actually. It's one of the most expensive pieces of Bay Trail built so far because of the topography there. And it's one of the most dramatic parts, I would say, because it's right across the Golden Gate Bridge. It goes up some elevation, so you get incredible views from it. But again, the village is cut off from that resource, nearby resource, by motorist traffic on Gilman, which is what would have to be transited to get out to the Bay Trail if you were biking. Now there is a path that exists, as some of you probably know, along Cornesis Creek between 8th and actually 5th Street. So that part's there. But if you want to go out to the waterfront, you can go down 6th, which is relatively low traffic north of Gilman. But then Gilman itself has cycling lanes with a lot of motorist traffic. And then once you cross 2nd Street, it has no cycling lanes. And it's, what some people will call a grinder because there's so much chaotic motorist traffic there. So there's fortunately a project in the works That's actually supposed to start construction, I believe, in just a couple of months to resolve this issue so that University Village residents can actually access the waterfront without getting in a car or walking or biking through a really high stressful interchange. So this project is going to upgrade this 5th Harrison 4th connection. It's going to put a new traffic signal at 4th so that people biking and walking will be able to cross. And it's going to build a bike path along the south side of Gilman, and then a bike and walking overpass of the freeway, similar to the overpass south of University, if you're familiar with that overpass. And if I got it organized, which I don't know if I do, I have a video I can show of what that will look like. Yeah. So part of the project is building roundabouts for the motorists, but the part that I want to show you is this part, which is the part 4. Yeah, so this is, I'll go ahead and pause it. So this is as if you're riding westbound on the south side of Gilman. So Gilman is over to the right here, and you can see this roundabout that's going to be constructed to try to rationalize the motorist flow a little bit.
No, you're not sharing it, I don't think.
Ah, okay, thank you. I think I have to stop share and appreciate that. I think I shared the application instead of my desktop. So let me share screen. How's that?
Good.
Can you see a visualization of the street now?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, great. All right, so this is at 2nd Street looking west down this new bike path with the roundabout here, and you can see a motorist is about to go around the roundabout. We'll go ahead and start it up again. So onto the bike path. You can see there is a crossing here. So this is the East Shore Highway, but East Shore Highway is going to be transitioned so that it's one lane coming in, and with a very narrow point there due to bulb outs and the signage to make it so the motorists go slower and it's more comfortable to cross right there. You know what? I don't think this is the video that I want. So this video is showing going under the overpass, which is also a route that is being improved because there was realization not all people want to take the bridge. This is the one I want to show. I apologize for that. So heading west on the bike path, there are the railroad tracks. Just crossing 2nd Street. Yeah, okay, so now we're crossing, and now we're going to the overpass. So just one lane crossing there and onto the overpass. I don't know why they took the visualization right through that person. So very similar to the overpass at University, south of University. And so just stairway there to the left, if you're walking and you want to head south on the Bay Trail. And if you're headed to the athletic fields, or you're biking to the north, or you're biking period, then you can come back down to grade. And so that overpass jumps you over the freeway and the frontage road, and brings you over to the Bay Trail. So let me try to find out where I was here. Yeah. So that all of a sudden is gonna make that whole shorefront much more available to people that live in University Village. And it took some doing to get the agency that is funding this project to actually add this bike path and add the signal here and these improvements to make this connection. So I was just going to build the overpass and leave it at that. And the active transportation advocacy community, Preston, said, well, if you build the overpass, that's great, but the Berkeley survey data says you might get 3% of the people who are going to use that overpass. Well, probably not, because the people who are willing to ride Gilman don't need the overpass. They're probably going to go right through the interchange. So you're going to build an overpass at a cost of 14 million, and it's behind a moat of motorists, such that it's going to completely underperform as an investment by our society. And so with a lot of wrangling, that perspective gained traction, and there was a lot of wrangling on, okay, how can we actually connect this overpass with similar facilities such that people who want the low stress of an overpass will actually have a low stress way to connect to it. And so after many months of planning and looking at different routes and different options, this is the one that emerged. And I actually led the charge on this, and I was adamant about it because that it connect to the north, because I said, look, the main population in this area concentration is University Village. And so if this doesn't provide a low stress connection to University Village, then you're missing most of the clientele who would use this investment. And so there was a lot of pushback on that, but the group, to its credit, gathered a lot of interesting data. And the result was, yeah, most of the use is likely to come from the north. So there needs to be a northern connection. So this project is supposed to start construction, like I say, in a few months' time. I don't know exactly, but a few months' time. Now, constructing the overpass is probably going to take 2 years, from what I hear. Building the roundabout is going to take about a year. I think the construction of the roundabout is going to start about a year after the start of construction of the overpass. So again, unless you're an early PhD student, I'm sorry to say this one's not going to be as readily available to you. Yeah. So next topic I'll talk about is the new graduate residences that I guess you could say are proposed. I think it's probably fair to say they're planned because UC seems to be on a fairly fast track from the information I've represented to build those. And so these are north of Monroe, between Sprouts and the existing residences in University Village. So for the residents of that future project, they'll be able to access the Greenway via the existing path that was built along Village Creek as a part of building Sprouts. And then there is actually what's called a cycle track along the west side of San Pablo that connects across Monroe and also down to this signal. And you might be familiar with this, but this is what it looks like at Monroe, looking north. And this was another project that Strollers and Rollers fought for hard. It actually ended up suing both the city and the University of California over the climate change mitigation measure for the Sprouts project and the senior residences. And fortunately was able to come to a settlement agreement that resulted in essentially a guarantee that this facility would be built. Part of the reason it was such a heavy lift was that, to my knowledge, this is the first facility of its type ever built on an urbanized section of a state highway anywhere in California. So San Pablo Avenue, you may not know, is a state highway, Highway 123. And so it is not controlled by Albany. It's actually controlled by Caltrans. And so getting this done actually required Caltrans approval. And as I say, it's the first time to my knowledge Caltrans approved a facility like this in an urbanized context. So those residents will have a low stress way to connect to the campus should they choose to bike. Another resource, other part of the Bay Trail that's nearby to University Village, which probably people are more likely to be familiar with because there's actually reasonable access to get there now, is out here on Buchanan. And so the question is, how can university residents bike there? Well, at this time, there's an existing path that goes there from Jackson. So that's fairly low stress, other than perhaps the crossing of Buchanan and Pierce, but that is signalized. And as a part of the city's interaction with the university regarding the planned graduate student residences, we are exploring with the university continuing this path on Village Creek so it connects to Jackson, so that people who live in this part of the existing village will be able to head straight east on Village Creek and then use the cycle track in order to gain access to the Greenway to go to campus. We're also exploring with the university adding a bike path along the side of Buchanan, so to be a cycling facility that's separated from motorists. And that would serve a number of purposes. It would again provide better access to this route out to the waterfront. For the city's purposes, this is Ocean View School, elementary school in the north, which is being reconstructed. And so having a path built into the front of the school, which we're talking to the school district as well, would facilitate students be able to access the school by biking. Again, both from the village and from residences to the north of Buchanan. So those discussions are in a fairly early stage. Staff met with UC. We raised these desires in the meeting that we had with the school, two of the school board members and university staff about a month ago. And Albany staff just met with university staff yesterday to continue that conversation. So I don't know what has come out of that yet, but we're hopeful. The flip side of this is that the city of Albany has no actual authority over anything the university does that is to further its educational mission. So because this obviously graduate student residences are to advance its educational mission, the city does not have approval authority over that construction or the plans. So the university can build it without building any additional cycling infrastructure or routes should it choose. There's really not that much Albany can do about it. On the other hand, what is proposed is residences with 800 beds or bedrooms. I believe they're arranged in 4-bedroom suites, around a central living area kitchen. And so, 200 of those residences, and they're proposing 200 car parking spaces. And so they're emphasizing that they really are going to lean into doing more to improve transportation between University Village and the campus, in recognition that they would not be providing as many car parking spaces, I think, as they have for residents in the rest of the village. So that is at least a soft power means that we can ask the university, well, you said you're going to improve transportation infrastructure. You said you want students to get to the campus not using their own cars or cars in general. So that seems consonant with adding these cycling infrastructure. And yeah, with that, go back to the existing condition here, and I'll just give you a look at this schematic map. So again, it shows University Village in here, and in this map is based on the iconography of subway maps, part maps, the London Tube, things like that. So it's organized as a different color for each route, if you will. So the Greenway is green. This route shown here is red, which is the Buchanan path, going to that cycle track and then going to the Greenway and further east. It shows that path along Cornelius Creek, you've got those 2 blocks missing between 10th and 8th right now. So it shows the route around that. And on the back side, there's a detail that covers University Village. So this is more details. You can see that hot signal here. There is a signal at Monroe that actually has a cycling signal phase. So it actually has its own signal head for people who are cycling, and that will go green at a time that it's safe for people to bike across. So again, this is a resource that can be made available presumably through the VRA web presence. And there we go.
Thank you. That was really informative, and I'm very excited about especially the Gilman Street interchange improvement and the bridge. That's really great news. Even driving there is a nightmare, and I'm just way too afraid to go there on a bike.
Oh yeah, it's people call it a meat grinder. Because if you go in there, it's just like going into the teeth of the machine, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks like we have CJ Christopher raised his hand.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I'm curious as to what happens to the homeless that are using that area right there at Gilman, at the encampment right now.
Yeah, so it's a good question. The improvements to the long and the short is they're going to tear the entire thing up. So I don't know what the agencies are planning in that regard, but I can't imagine that people who live there are going to be able to remain during the construction project. I don't know what the plans are. I would presume and hope, but it's just a presumption that they have some plans. But I really don't know. It is a good question.
So I'm sorry.
The organization that is pursuing that project is the Alameda County Transportation Commission. So I can, so I would suggest calling them up and say, hey, what's the deal? How's it supposed to work?
Okay, follow-up question on that would be last year, I remember the City Council of Albany voted to spend $11 million for consulting services to figure out a solution for the encampments down there. What was the outcome of that?
Well, that probably wasn't the Albany City Council because that's actually in Berkeley.
That was Berkeley?
And Albany doesn't have $11 million, so. So just for scale, Albany is probably the 2020 census will show it's 20,000 people. It's been growing a bit. It is, the inhabited area is about a square mile, a little over a square mile. And Berkeley is about 120,000 people, and a much larger inhabited area. So there was actually an April Fool's Day column done by a guy in Berkeley. It was in Berkeley side, and the column started, Albany becomes Berkeley's 9th council district, because we're about the size of a Berkeley council district.
I heard my internet was cutting out, but I heard you mention something about other construction projects around the bike path. Could you mind reiterating that again? If there's time, just quickly. Thank you.
Sure. So the other projects are, this project almost certainly will be funded. So this is along Cordnesis Creek between 10th and 8th Street. So this is currently where the Little League ball fields are, and the Little League ball fields will remain. The path is going to be built just on the outside of the fence from the field itself. There's currently some bleachers there. Those bleachers are going to be moved, and that will be used for the path. And then it's going to go along the side of the existing parking lot. The parking lot will get shrunk down a little bit. I think there's a parking lot probably for staff of the community center because it's on that side of Jackson. And then brought all the way through to 8th Street where it'll connect with this existing path. And then I think the other one I showed. Yeah, so these are notional. So while this one is funded, well, this one is almost certain to be funded. This one is funded as far as I know. And they actually, I think they put out a request for bids, and maybe we can open construction bids on this one already. This is entirely notional at this point. This is really a project of opportunity. So Albany had in its bicycle master plan an improved cycling route along Jackson to connect the Berkeley bike boulevards with Albany's planned bike boulevard network to the north. But because it was university property, it's not really anything that Albany could do, particularly to make it happen. And so when I learned about this this planned residence this year. It was like, well, this is the opportunity. You know, if we're going to make it happen, now's the time. Particularly because, as almost for sure, as part of building these residences, they're going to have to rebuild the frontage of Jackson here. The Albany Unified School District is rebuilding the front of Jackson here. So between those two, you've got maybe half of an edge of the street that's being rebuilt along the length between the Buchanan path and the Cornelius Creek path. So if we can get those two pieces built, then that ups the likelihood of being able to get grant funding to fill in the other two pieces, which would be here and here, because granting agencies love to be the ones that drive the golden spike. So if you say, hey, we built all this stuff and we just need, the last 500 feet, then they can claim credit for having funded the last 500 feet to make the complete facility.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. So I don't know how that strikes you all. You live there. I don't. So as somebody who's hopefully trying to represent you, the current concept is that the bike path would be on the west side of Jackson in front of the elementary school to facilitate access to the elementary school. And because that is the side that's being rebuilt, there's an existing stop sign at the southern corner of the school, cross over, and then the bike path would continue along the east side all the way down to Cornelius Creek, because that's where the new residences are going to be built, and two, the rest of the frontage is not, overly occupied by existing development. So that said, it would take up, some strip of land that is currently within the research facility, the agricultural research facility. So, pluses and minuses there. So I don't know how that strikes anybody.
And I'll touch on this really quick. So any potential plans for bus routes through there, so bus stops and a bike route, would all be predicated on what the final design of that building is going to be, that new construction, as well as, and more currently, the Ocean View redesign of their parking area and their kid drop-off area. They're still, as far as we know, still going through iterations of what that's going to look like. And of course, that would change where that final bus stop is going to be. Currently, it sits on Albany and Jackson, but there might be another one further down. And what a bike path would look like in terms of how wide it would be and which side of the street.
Yeah, that's what I said. Staff, Albany City staff, planning staff met with, I think, UC Capital staff yesterday, Capital Planning staff yesterday to discuss some of this. So the information I just provided may already be out of date. I haven't gotten an update on what came out of that meeting. Not in terms of the overall idea of having a cycling facility along Jackson, but the details of which side, where, how wide, things like that.
So is the overpass for the Gilman Street area already funded?
Yes, it's already funded. Yeah, so as I said, they put out a request for bids to build it. So,
Okay.
and you can really thank Berkeley's Transportation Commission for that, because originally the project was just going to be roundabouts. It's an improvement for motorists. And this goes back, I don't know. I mean, these kinds of projects take a decade, more than a decade, to actually get a shovel in the ground. So this goes back a number of years, but they took it to the Berkeley Transportation Commission. The Transportation Commission said, well, this is not consonant with Berkeley planning at all. If we have a complete streets policy, which means projects have to address people traveling by all modes. If this is only going to be a motorist project, then we're not going to approve it. And so they basically got the overpass added as a project element because of that. Yeah, it's really, my experience in Albany is I've been advocating for things for, I don't know, it's about 1998. In 1998, I advocated for this path that goes underneath the freeway on-ramp, if you're familiar with that area at all. Because before that, you had to cross the on-ramp was fairly dangerous because it was what's called a large radius turn. So motorists could take that turn at very high speed and come around the corner and not be able to stop in time if you were there crossing. And so my experience advocating all these various things over the years, as an advocate, it's been that it's the median time from when idea to actual implementation, 7 years. So, and you pretty much got to be at every meeting that touches on the item over those years to make sure it doesn't go off the rails. So the original plan, and I think this freeway interchange is a good example, the original plan was for this path to come down in a more graceful curve, go under the on-ramp and then come back. And I was on the Transportation Commission in 94, 95 before I went to get my master's degree. And that was the plan they showed us. I was like, oh, that's great. Wonder, that's a creative idea to take it under the overpass. And then as I was getting my master's degree and watching them rebuild the interchange, I was like, well, where's the path? And they didn't build the path. And what they did instead was they had this crossing of the freeway on-ramp. And I came to learn later what happened is the plan went to the city council, and the city council, who was comprised mostly of people who didn't bike or walk at the time, was like, well, we don't want people going under the on-ramp. It could be dangerous under that. That's pretty sketchy. So we want Caltrans, we want you to cross the on-ramp. It's like, kind of reminds me of the prevailing conventional wisdom about stranger danger to children. It's like strangers really aren't, particularly compared to when I was growing up, true strangers are almost a non-danger to children. Now it's not 100%, but compared to getting run over by a car, it's order of magnitude less. But people tend to focus on, what if somebody makes a decision to hurt me, as opposed to a motorist who just inadvertently smashes into you. And so the city council rated, well, it's better to get smashed by somebody in a car than it is to go under the underpass and maybe get accosted. And so having had that experience, my kids were, at that point, I think my son had just been born. I was like, this is not, I would go down there and actually, there was no path, but I would carry my bike with my son down the bank, under the on-ramp, and then back up the other side because I was so afraid of crossing the on-ramp. And so I started fighting for that additional path to go underneath. And lo and behold, it's there and it's fine. I've never had any problems going under there, and there's a lot of people that use it. So one of those things, you miss one meeting on an issue you care about, it can just completely go off the rails.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that having the option to go underneath the freeway or the on-ramp and the freeway is really great. We go that route quite frequently. And I remember looking at the active transportation plan and seeing some plan to extend the path along Cordonices Creek, like possibly in a bridge over straight across. And I'm assuming that now that this other bridge is going in, that won't be happening.
Yeah, wow, you really do your homework. I like it. I love it. So I was on the Alameda County Transportation Commission's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee when this project came to it, and started pushing really hard, saying, you want to match the overpass experience to the ground level experience. And so what really makes sense is to connect the overpass to the Cordonices Creek path. And so, to the credit, a new project manager had just come in to manage the project, and she was a project manager for example, if you know the Zampa Bridge, it's the new Carquina Strait Bridge, the suspension bridge with a bike path on it, which you wouldn't really necessarily have had occasion to go to. But she's a project manager for that project, which is a, I don't know, $500 million project. So she really knew her stuff. And she knew you've got to, it's better to deal with the community upfront and honestly than later in confrontation. So she heard that I'd been pushing this issue and that other people have been pushing this issue, and convened a planning and engineering group with the stakeholders and the appropriate planners and engineers. And we probably looked at literally, I think, 20 different overpass alignments what could work, what wouldn't work. This southern crossing was the alignment that was brought to that committee when I was on it. And so we looked at all sorts of other possible configurations, and in the end, we concluded that that was the best space, the best place. And then that's what led to adding this bike path to the east. The problem with going here is the clearance requirements for a railroad are actually quite a bit greater than they are for a freeway. So the path would have, so the overpass would have to start, you know, like way back in this area to get enough height to get over the railroad. And then it would basically have to stay at that height over the freeway and then turn and stay at that height until you came south of Gilman to connect to the Bay Trail. So it was going to be, you know, a much bigger structure. Homegate Fields was freaked out by it because they said having this overpass with people on it above their stables would be a problem for them in terms of horses. I mean, they even had visions of people like throwing cigarette butts down into the stables and stuff, which I think it was a little bit histrionic, but you know, they throw whatever they can into it, just like any advocate does. We looked at another alignment where it would have taken off using Berkeley Street, Harrison, and have gone up and over the railroad, and that would have made use of Berkeley owns a big piece of property in here for its waste transfer station, and it's in the throes of planning to rebuild that. Doesn't have the funding to rebuild it, but it's planning that, you know, reconstruction, doing the planning and engineering. We thought, well, we can bring the overpass through its property and shorten up the distance. But the Berkeley said, yeah, we don't want to have to incorporate this overpass into our engineering and planning for rebuilding the property for waste transfer, which seemed kind of reasonable. Plus, we don't necessarily want to have people walking right over a waste transfer station. So yeah, in the end, the Southern Crossing was the one, but courtesy of this new project manager, I came out of feeling like, okay, we did diligence in trying to figure out where this thing can be put in a reasonable fashion for a reasonable amount of money.
Yeah, thanks for that background.
Thanks for the
So,
question.
yeah, any other questions? Right, well, I'm going to stop the Facebook Live video and thank everyone for joining us. And follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our mailing list to get notified about our next meeting. And all right, thank you.